The rain had begun mid-morning, a quiet drizzle that made the city blur at the edges. It painted the sidewalks in glistening reflections and darkened the shoulders of coats as people hurried along, heads down, thoughts tucked beneath umbrellas. But Claire didn't mind the rain. She never had. It softened things. And as a nurse in the trauma unit at St. Bridget's Hospital, she welcomed anything that muted the edges of a harsh world. Her shift had ended just before noon, a rare thing to be released early. She had stayed 2 hours late the night before, holding the hand of a teenager with fractured ribs and a fractured family, and her supervisor had insisted she take the morning to breathe. So Claire walked, warm coffee in one hand, her other tucked into the pocket of her navy scrub jacket. The city was quieter in this part, an older district where the buildings leaned with age and the streets were narrow with stories. She passed the bakery with the lace curtains, the antique bookstore whose owner always waved through the window, and just as she turned the corner toward her apartment, she saw him. At first, she thought he was sleeping. A man curled awkwardly near the base of a lamppost, one leg bent beneath him, his shoulder against the stone wall, but something in her stomach tugged. She slowed. The man was too still, not in the way of rest but of collapse. Claire knelt beside him, her bag slipping from her shoulder. "Sir," she said softly. He stirred, a groan escaped him. His face was pale, drawn tight with pain, and then she saw it, the blood, dark, seeping through the side of his shirt. Her nurse's mind switched on. She pressed 2 fingers gently to his neck. Pulse, rapid but there. His clothes were torn at the hem, his left hand scraped raw. "Sir, you're bleeding. Can you tell me what happened?" His eyes fluttered open, gray-blue, sharp even through the haze. "Knife," he muttered, didn't see him. "Okay," she said calmly, already pulling her scarf off and pressing it gently against the wound. "You're going to be all right. I'm a nurse. Help is coming." She called for an ambulance, her voice steady though her heart raced. He was in shock, the wound deep but likely missed any major arteries. Still, every minute counted. She stayed with him, her hands pressed firm, murmuring words she barely heard herself say. He kept his eyes on her. When he winced, she squeezed his hand. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. "Ilias." "Ilias, you're going to be okay. You're safe." The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. Claire gave a quick report, then stepped back, letting the paramedics do their work. They loaded him into the back, the doors swinging closed with a finality that always left her unsettled. She watched until the sirens faded, then looked down. Her scarf was soaked through. The coffee in her hand had gone cold. Claire didn't know why she couldn't stop thinking about him. She didn't even know his last name. The following weeks blurred. St. Bridget's was short-staffed again. One of the ER nurses took maternity leave early. Claire picked up extra shifts without hesitation. That was how she was built, steady, dependable, the type of person who remembered everyone's birthdays and brought tea to the night nurse who always forgot her lunch. But some nights she thought of Ilias. She had called the hospital where he'd been taken, asked in her most casual voice if a male in his 30s with a knife wound had been admitted that day. Privacy laws gave her nothing. She told herself to let it go. Still, when she walked the streets near where she found him, her eyes searched. One evening, nearly 4 weeks later, she was in the hospital garden. Her shift had ended late, and the chill of autumn had crept into the air. She sat beneath the oak tree, sipping tea from a paper cup, her scrubs smudged with long hours. "Claire." She turned. He stood at the garden entrance, wearing a gray coat, his left hand bandaged, a fading bruise at his jaw. He looked healthier, stronger, but it was him. Ilias. Her heart paused. "I didn't know if you worked here," he said, stepping closer. How did you find me?" "You left your name with the paramedics. I remembered it. Took a few tries asking around." Claire stood. "You're okay." "Thanks to you." They stared at each other for a long moment. There was something unspoken between them, something that had lingered that day on the sidewalk and stretched into now. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "Would you, maybe want to get coffee?" Claire hesitated. She never gave out yesies easily. But she looked into his eyes again, those gray-blue eyes she hadn't been able to forget. "Yes," she said, "I would." They left together. The garden gate clicked softly behind them. Ilias walked beside her with an easy silence, his steps careful, like someone learning to move through the world again. Claire noticed he still favored his left side, how his hand curled protectively near his ribs when they crossed the street, how he breathed a little deeper before stepping off a curb. The wound had mended clearly, but healing was more than physical. She understood that better than most. They ended up in a narrow cafe tucked between a flower shop and a pharmacy, one Claire had visited often during long shifts. The owner, an older woman with silver hair always tied in a green ribbon, gave Claire a warm smile as they stepped inside. They sat near the window. Elias ordered black coffee. Claire chose chamomile. It was late for caffeine, but he said he needed something strong. His voice was rough in a way that sounded lived in, not weary, like a man who had spent more time alone than among others and who wasn't quite sure yet how to open his hands to the world. Claire waited while he added 2 sugars, stirring slowly. I wanted to see you sooner, he said, eyes on his cup. But I wasn't in great shape, I figured. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't even remember me. I remembered, she said simply. That seemed to steady something in him. They talked quietly at first, about the neighborhood, about books, about the bakery across the street whose cinnamon rolls could change a day. It wasn't deep, not yet, but there was warmth, no rush. Claire had always been good at giving space where it was needed. After a while, Elias leaned back in his chair. I was walking home from work that day, he said. Late, I do carpentry, mostly freelance now. Someone stopped me, asked for the time. I turned, and that's when it happened. You didn't report it. He shook his head, didn't see the face, didn't want the noise that comes with all that. I've had enough of it in the past. She didn't press, his shoulders had tensed just slightly. The cafe light caught the stubble on his jaw, made his eyes look stormy. I'm glad you were there, he added. Claire reached across the table without thinking and touched the back of his hand. It wasn't flirtation, it was something quieter, a recognition, that maybe they both knew what it was like to be hurt and keep moving anyway. He didn't pull away. They started meeting once a week. Sometimes it was tea after her shift, sometimes it was breakfast on the mornings he didn't have a job lined up. Once, she invited him to a gallery night at a small community center where her friend had photographs on display. He didn't say much, but he listened carefully to everything she did. Claire noticed things like that. There were days he didn't text back, days he disappeared for a while. But he always came back, and when he did, he looked at her like she'd kept something safe for him while he was gone. One morning he showed her a small box of wooden carvings, birds mostly, and one of a hand cupped around a flame. Sometimes I don't know how to say things, he said, so I make them. Claire held the bird he gave her, a robin, finely shaped, its wings tucked in like it had just landed after a long flight. She didn't say anything then, but she kept it on her bedside table. The city turned colder, leaves thickened in gutters, her shifts grew longer as flu season crept in. Claire grew tired, but she never told Elias when she'd spent all night holding pressure on someone's chest or when a child had been brought in too late. She didn't want to put those things on him. But one night after she came home soaked through and silent, she found him waiting at her door. He didn't say anything, just held out a paper bag with warm soup inside. He'd made it himself. I figured it was one of those days, he said. She didn't cry, not then, but she let him stay. They sat on the couch with the lights low, knees touching, and for the first time she let her head rest against his shoulder. You're good at knowing, she whispered. I try to be. And he was. Still, they didn't call it love. Claire wasn't the kind of person to name things too quickly, and Elias had too many shadows behind his smile for easy words. But when her father was hospitalized after a stroke and she had to take 3 days off to sit by his bedside, Elias brought her fresh clothes and sat in the waiting room with a book, not asking for anything, just being there. That's when something shifted. She watched him hold a cup of vending machine coffee, his coat wrinkled from sleep, and realized she'd stopped thinking of him as someone she was still getting to know. He had become something else, something settled, rooted, the kind of presence that calmed the world around it. Her father recovered slowly, and when Claire thanked Elias with quiet sincerity, he only smiled and said, You found me when I was bleeding into the street. This is the least I can do. But they both knew it had become more than repayment. It had grown into devotion, slow and careful and real. On the first snow of the season, they walked through the park, boots crunching softly. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. Inside was another carving, this time of 2 hands gently clasped with a single line etched beneath in delicate script. Stay, it read. Claire looked up at him. I don't know how to say it right, Elias said, voice low, but I'm better with you. I think I've been waiting a long time to feel safe. You make things quiet in my head, and I want to stay if that's something you want too. She didn't answer with words. She just stepped forward, folded her arms around him in the falling snow, and held him like home. It wasn't a ring. Not yet. But something had begun. The first time Elias kissed her was in the hallway outside her apartment just after midnight. She'd come home from a double shift, her eyes heavy, scrub pants wrinkled at the knees. He hadn't planned to be there, but when he saw her light flicker on from the street, he came upstairs anyway, a folded note in his coat pocket he never gave her. He didn't ask if she wanted company. He just looked at her for a moment, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a touch that felt like a breath, and kissed her like he didn't want to startle the quiet between them. And when she kissed him back, tired and aching and still somehow whole, it wasn't fireworks, it was steadiness. It was everything she hadn't known she'd needed until then. From that night on, he stayed more often than not. He never brought much, a toothbrush, a few shirts, the little folding knife he used for his carving, but she began to notice his presence in her space like warmth settling into old wood. He washed the mugs without asking, left kind notes when she worked nights, built a small shelf by her kitchen window where she could grow herbs because she once said she missed green things in winter. Claire didn't talk much about her past. It wasn't because it was filled with pain, just absence. Her mother had passed when she was a child. Her father, though kind, had never quite known how to fill the space left behind. Claire had learned early how to be the calm in the room, how to carry her own weight without complaint. But Elias asked softly, never prying, just opening space. He had his own silences, the ones about his childhood, the ones about his brother who died 4 years ago in a house fire, about how after that, Elias stopped taking jobs that felt like building other people's lives while his own had fallen in. He spoke of it once, sitting cross-legged on her rug, while she trimmed bandages for a first aid kit she kept stocked out of habit. My brother used to say I was good at fixing things, he murmured. Funny how you can be good at fixing and still feel like everything's broken. Claire knelt beside him, touched his shoulder and said, "You're not broken." She meant it. One evening in late January, she came home to the smell of roasted garlic and thyme. Elias had cooked. She walked in to find the table set with candles, the little wooden bird he'd carved perched at the center. She tilted her head. "What's all this?" He looked shy, standing there with an apron loosely tied around his waist. "Just thought you deserved a dinner that wasn't eaten from a paper cup." They ate slowly like time had softened. After they played cards, talked about things that didn't matter and things that did. And when she curled beside him on the couch, her feet tucked beneath his thigh, he said, almost as if to the room, "I've been thinking about staying for good." Claire looked at him. "I mean here," he said, "not just at your place, but in something that feels like a real life again, with someone with you." She didn't speak for a while, she just reached for his hand and held it. "Then let's build that," she said. A few weeks later, she got sick. Not serious, but the kind of fever that knocks a person flat and makes even the thought of moving feel like a mountain. She didn't call him, didn't want a burden, but he knew something was wrong when she didn't answer her phone after her shift should have ended. He let himself in using the spare key she'd quietly given him 2 weeks before. She was in bed, curled under layers, cheeks flushed. "Hey," he said gently, "why didn't you tell me?" She murmured something groggy, then reached for him like she was trying to catch a dream. Elias stayed. He brought her water, fed her soup by spoonfuls, brushed damp hair from her forehead and stayed up when she tossed and turned. And when she woke crying from a fevered dream, something about a patient she'd lost, he didn't ask questions. He just pulled her into his arms and whispered until she slept again. The next morning she opened her eyes to sunlight pouring over the bed, and Elias asleep in the armchair, one hand still resting on her knee. She watched him for a long time. And that's when she knew. It wasn't just comfort anymore, wasn't even just love. It was him. In early spring, her father asked to meet him. Claire had mentioned Elias slowly, in pieces, until her father asked if she'd bring him by. The meeting was awkward but honest. Elias wore a buttoned shirt and brought a small wooden cross he'd carved because her father used to keep one on his nightstand before the stroke. They sat in the living room, sipping tea, talking about the city's potholes and how late snow always ruins the daffodils. When they left, her father said quietly, "He listens well, that's rare." Claire smiled. "I know." One night in April, she found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by wood shavings. The window was open, breeze moving gently through the curtains. He was working on something, the same concentration she'd seen in surgery rooms where lives turned on seconds. "What is it?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Elias glanced up, then showed her. It was a tiny box, smooth and round, carved with the image of two trees whose branches had grown so close they had tangled at the top. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about the morning you found me. I didn't expect anyone to stop. I was ready for it to be over." Claire's breath caught. "I wasn't afraid to die," he said, "but I didn't know how to keep living, not really, and then, there you were, in the rain, kneeling beside me like I was worth something." She reached for his hand. You are. He swallowed, then looked at the box in his palm. I didn't know what I had to give you. I'm still not sure. But I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the way you looked at me that day. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, silver, a small stone set deep like a secret. Her eyes filled. I love you, he said, more than I know how to say, and if you'll have me, if you'll say yes. I'd spend every day trying to be the man you saw on that street, the one worth saving. Claire looked at him through tears, then nodded. Yes, she said, 1,000 times yes. And in the stillness of that spring night, she leaned into him, into the promise between them, and knew. She had never saved a life that saved her back like this. The wedding was small, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't looking closely. Just a circle of friends and a few family members gathered beneath the low canopy of trees in a garden behind a local conservatory. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh blossoms. Claire wore a soft ivory dress that brushed the tops of her shoes. Elias stood in a navy suit, sleeves rolled just slightly past the wrist, a small wooden pin of 2 birds nestled at his collar. They didn't care for ceremony, not really. What mattered was the way they looked at each other when the vows were spoken, not loud, not elaborate, but true. I promise to notice the little things, Claire said, her hands shaking just slightly in his. To make you tea when the world is too much, to ask, are you okay, and mean it, and to love you in the quiet ways for all the days I get. Elia's voice was steady when he answered. I promise to hold your heart like something breakable but never out of fear, to stay even when the silence gets heavy, and to never forget that I'm here because you stopped and cared, that you gave me a second chance when I didn't even ask for one. Their fingers linked like the words had stitched them into something new. No one clapped when it was over. Instead, there was a soft hush, the kind that settles over a room when something sacred passes through. Later, at the little cafe where they first sat across from each other months ago, they held a reception. Mismatched chairs, candlelight, laughter. A small band played in the corner and her father danced with her slowly, smiling like he'd remembered something he thought he'd lost long ago. When they left that night, Elias carried her shoes in one hand and his jacket in the other. They walked home barefoot beneath stars, fingers intertwined, neither of them saying much. Some things don't need saying. Their first year together was full of becoming. They moved into a house near the edge of the park, not large, but with wide windows and creaking floors and a garden out back. Elias built their bed frame by hand. Claire planted lavender in the kitchen window. They painted the walls with colors that reminded them of things they loved: seafoam, dusk, bread crust. Mornings began with toast and shared headlines. Evenings ended with music humming low in the background, her feet in his lap as she charted late-night notes on her patients. Sometimes she brought work home with her, not the files or the physical strain, but the weight. The patient whose hand she held as the monitors flattened, the child whose mother sat beside him every day hoping for a sign that didn't come. Claire carried those faces quietly, she always had. Elias noticed, he never pressed for details. He just built her a wooden box with her name carved into the lid and said, for anything you want to let go of, even if it's just a note you write and never read again. She used it more than he knew. And when Elias had hard days, jobs that fell through, memories that reached up from the deep, he'd take long walks in the early dark, then come home to her arms like a harbor he could finally anchor in. They weren't perfect, they argued sometimes, about whether he should take on a larger contract that required travel, about how often she let herself skip meals during double shifts. But the thing that held them was that neither of them ever left the room angry. They stayed, always, and that mattered more than anything. One rainy morning in late October, Claire found herself staring at a little white stick in the bathroom, her breath caught halfway between a question and an answer. 2 lines, faint but there. She sat on the edge of the tub, her hand pressed to her mouth. She hadn't been planning for it, they hadn't been trying, but something in her didn't feel afraid. When she told Elias that evening, nervous, cheeks pink, fingers laced in her lap, he didn't say a word at first. He just looked at her, his eyes wide, then reached out and touched her stomach like he was asking permission. Are you happy? She whispered. He nodded, swallowed hard, then smiled. I didn't know I could be, he said. Pregnancy changed things, of course. Claire still worked but fewer hours. Her feet swelled and she hated the way her back ached during the 3rd trimester. Elias built a rocking chair for the nursery, one that creaked just slightly, like it already held stories in its grain. They didn't find out the baby's gender. They wanted to meet the child as they were. When labor came, it was long, 32 hours. Claire was exhausted. Her hair stuck to her forehead, and at one point she wept, saying she didn't know if she had anything left. Elias stayed at her side through all of it, whispering, "You're stronger than anything I've ever known." And when the baby finally arrived, small, wrinkled, furious, and perfect, Claire held them to her chest and laughed through the tears. A girl. They named her June. The days that followed were a blur of feeding, swaddling, crying. Elias learned how to hold her just so, tucked in the crook of his arm. Claire discovered she could operate on 2 hours of sleep and still remember how to hum lullabies her mother once sang. Some nights they sat together in the nursery, June asleep on Claire's chest, Elias with his arm around them both. "She looks like you," he'd say. Claire would smile, then look down and whisper, "She looks like hope." And she did. Not the loud kind, not fireworks, but the kind that grows slowly in the quiet light of early morning when you realize you've survived things you didn't think you could, and now there's this soft, breathing proof that you made it through. One evening, as Claire rocked June to sleep, Elias stood in the doorway and watched them. She looked up. "What is it?" He stepped in, kissed her forehead, then knelt beside the chair and rested his cheek against her arm. "I was thinking," he said, "about the man I was when you found me, and how much of him is gone now, or maybe not gone, just healed." Claire reached out and brushed a hand through his hair. "You were always this man," she said. "You just needed someone to remind you." Elias looked at their daughter, her tiny fists curled beneath her chin, and then back at Claire. "You saved me." Claire held him with her eyes. "No," she said gently, "we saved each other." Years passed in the quiet way time sometimes does, not loudly or with grand declarations, but with the slow layering of seasons, soft moments stitched into the fabric of daily life. June grew like wildflowers, bright, tender, curious. She had Claire's stillness, that calm center even as a toddler, but Elias' restlessness too. She was forever climbing things, asking questions bigger than her years. Her laugh could fill the entire house, and when she cried, it was with her whole body, like every feeling demanded a full expression. On Claire's days off, they'd take walks through the park as a family. June would hold their hands and swing between them, squealing when her feet left the ground. Elias always brought sunflower seeds in his pocket just in case they saw birds. He liked to teach her names, sparrow, finch, wren, as if learning the language of small, winged things might give her some secret to carry. At night, Claire would read stories by lamplight while Elias carved quietly in the corner. He was slower now, more deliberate with his work, not because of age, but because he no longer felt rushed to prove himself. His pieces sold steadily, enough to keep the lights on and their home warm, but more often he gave them away to neighbors, friends, patients Claire brought home in her heart. One carving always stayed on their mantle, the pair of hands clasped with the words "stay" beneath them, the first one he ever made for her. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, Claire woke to the smell of cinnamon and saw Elias standing at the stove, June beside him, covered in flour and grinning. They'd baked, sort of. The cinnamon rolls were misshapen, slightly too brown, but when Claire laughed and bit into one, it tasted perfect. After breakfast, Elias handed her a small wrapped box. Inside was a carving of a treehouse nestled high in the branches, lights carved into its tiny windows. Beneath it, a little ladder just wide enough for two figures, side by side. "I never had one," he said, "as a kid, but I always dreamed about it, and now, this life we've built, it feels like that. A place off the ground, safe, made with our hands." Claire blinked through tears, then kissed him like the years hadn't passed at all. That afternoon, they took June to the lake. The sky was a soft silver, clouds drifting like slow sails. June found rocks to toss into the water. Elias lay back in the grass, eyes closed. Claire sat beside him, one hand resting over his heart, which still beat strong and steady. "I think," he murmured without opening his eyes, "if I hadn't met you, I would have just disappeared. Quietly. The kind of gone that no one really notices." She didn't reply right away, just moved her fingers slowly across the fabric of his shirt. "You didn't disappear," she said softly. "You came back." He opened his eyes then, turned his head to her. "I didn't just come back," he said. "I found my life." Claire retired from nursing not long after her 65th birthday, not because she had to, but because she felt ready. She still volunteered at the clinic down the road twice a week, still kept her certifications up, still packed bandages with care, and remembered the names of every patient who lingered in her mind. Elias' hands grew more worn with time, his knuckles thickening, his grip softening, but he still carved, slowly now, purposefully. He taught June how to use a blade carefully, how to sand with the grain, how to listen to the wood. She took to it like breath. The garage slowly turned into a shared workshop, sunlight pouring in through dusty windows, the smell of cedar and pine lingering in the air. Sometimes Claire would watch them from the kitchen window, her heart full in that quiet way, where love feels so big it almost doesn't fit inside the body. They never grew flashy, never became the kind of couple who threw parties or made announcements, but every Friday night they played cards by candlelight. Every Sunday morning Elias brought her tea in bed, and on cold evenings when the wind howled around the house, they curled beneath the quilt Claire's grandmother once made and listened to music from decades past. "I don't need anything more than this," Elias would whisper sometimes, as if confessing a secret. And Claire, smiling into the soft curve of his neck, would reply, "Neither do I." One winter when Claire grew ill for the first time in decades, Elias stayed by her side the way she once stayed by his. Her recovery was slow, but he was patient, reading aloud, holding her hand through the long afternoons. One night, as snow fell thick outside the window, he sat beside her in bed and said, "You remember that night in the rain, when you found me?" Claire nodded. "I think about it all the time," he said, "how close I was to being lost, and how somehow you were the one who saw me." "I didn't know anything about you," she said. "You knew enough," he whispered. He leaned in then and they kissed, gently, like they were still learning the shape of each other's hearts after all those years. When Elias passed quietly in his sleep years later, June was grown and Claire was not alone. He left behind a drawer full of carvings, some with names on the bottom, some without. Letters, notes, one last box placed gently on Claire's dresser with her name on it and a single carved line inside, "You were my reason." At the funeral, the chapel overflowed, not with grand speeches but with stories. A nurse he once brought lunch to, a neighbor whose fence he repaired without asking, a teenager he taught to carve after school. People spoke of gentleness, of hands that built things, of quiet love. Claire stood beneath a gray sky after the service, her hand wrapped around June's. They watched the wind stir the bare trees. "He was never loud," June said softly. "No," Claire replied, "but he changed everything." Back home, in the house that still smelled faintly of wood and tea and the seasons they'd lived through, Claire sat in the rocking chair Elias had made so long ago. She looked out the window to where the garden had begun to green again and thought of the day she'd knelt beside a bleeding man in the rain. She hadn't been looking for love, she hadn't been thinking of anything except saving a life. But what she got back was a man who came into her world quietly, stayed with intention, and showed her what it meant to be seen completely. Their story wasn't a lightning strike. It was rain soft on a window pane, hands clasped in a hospital garden, a second chance that bloomed not all at once but slowly, steadily, until it filled the whole sky. And in the stillness of the years that followed, Claire carried that love like a lantern inside her. Not as a memory, but as a light that had once saved them both.